Agit Ner Shabbos, everybody. Welcome to Jerry's Corona Contemplations for Parshat Vayeshev and Shabbat Chanukah. Freilich and Chanukah, everyone. Enjoy the jelly donuts. Throughout the last number of weeks, we've been discussing how very significant events in the lives of our avot and imahot, our forefathers and mothers, all seem to occur around a well. In particular, Eliezer, of course, meeting Rivka, a spouse for Yitzchak, the story of Be'erot Yitzchak, and how Yitzchak gained great wealth and made peace with the Plishtim, and how Yaakov met Rachel by the well. And the well is always akin to life and Torah. We know the Torah is compared to water because it's life-giving. We can't live without it. But this week something very different occurs. We actually see Yosef HaTzadik being thrown into the well, or the cistern. His father Yaakov sends him to go see what's doing with his brothers in Shechem. And we know the story of the dreams, and they were jealous of him and they hated him. And instead of killing him, which is what they wanted to do, they threw him into a pit. And of course, Yehuda, who became the Melech, he went over and said, no, we're not gonna, let's not kill anyone, let's pull him out of the well, let's pull him out of the cistern and sell him. So, what's the difference? Again, remember, the Torah doesn't waste real estate. So if we're being told something, we're being told something for a reason. So again, what's with the pit? And we know Rashi says the pit wasn't empty, that it had snakes and scorpions, but the Torah tells us, V'habor reik, ein bo mayim. Okay, if the bar is reik, I know there's no water in it, so we know Rashi says, mayim, there wasn't water, but there were, dangerous snakes and scorpions. But let's look at the pshat. Ein bo mayim. This is not a well of water. This is not a life-giving event. This is something that led to some really bad stuff happening, and it happened for a very bad reason, for a the Torah is teaching us a very important lesson. Jealousy, which is perhaps the worst of the midot, can lead to very negative consequences. And we see they were jealous of Yosef because of his father considered him the Bachar, because of the incident of Yosef, of Ruvain and Bilhah, and because he was the Bachar to Rachel, who was his first love, he believed Yosef was going to get the Malchut, and so he made him a royal garment as the firstborn. Okay, whether that was to be, we know that Yosef got the double portion, Ephraim and Manasseh, but the Malchut really went to Yehuda, particularly of this event, because he did save Yosef and they sold him down to Egypt. But that began the historic, and throughout our history, the whole idea of galut, of exile. Yosef was sent into Mitzrayim, and from there began the Masa Avot Simon Labanim, of the whole story of the Jews being out of their land and then being enslaved or persecuted, and eventually, as we Baruch Hashem have, come home to our land. But it's been a pretty long, hard galut. Interesting, the story of Yehuda. I mentioned Yehuda, how Yehuda saved Yosef. And interesting, right after that, the Torah tells us this story about how Yosef, Vayered Yehuda me'echav, I guess he he took off, and he was hanging out with his Adulamite friend Chira, and we know the whole story of Yehuda and Tamar. His sons Er and Onan were married to Tamar. Er dies, Onan does Yibum or doesn't do Yibum, and he winds up being with Tamar and having Peretz and Zerach. And Peretz, ma Paratz da Peretz, Peretz becomes he becomes the Bachar of Yehuda, and eventually the Malchut goes through Yehuda and Peretz, eventually to Boaz, and through Ruth, and to David HaMelech. And it's interesting that we see that because Yehuda would not kill his brother, but rather saved him. I mean, being sold into slavery isn't exactly a great deal, but as we'll see, that led to Yosef, of course, being the Melech in this case of Mitzrayim, not Paro, but the viceroy, and he wound up saving not only Am Yisrael, not only the Israelites, but the entire world. And here, of course, brings us to the whole issue of Yosef and the wife of Potiphar. So we know the story. Again, Yosef, he winds up in the house of Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife is the bored housewife, and she decides that she would like a boy toy. And Yosef, again, Rashi tells us, he, of course, was tempted. He is a guy, and those of us that are guys know how guys are, and even those that aren't know how guys are. But he kept the vision of his father Yaakov in front of him. He overcame his Yetzer Hara. Now let's go back to last week when we spoke about the DNA helix, Yaakov's dream. I know that was the parsha from 2 weeks ago, but we discussed it last week, and how that DNA came down the ladder into Yaakov and then into Yosef, because when Yaakov fought the Malach of Esav, he was really fighting his own Yetzer Hara. And it was that strength that Yaakov had by fighting the Malach of Esav, Samael, that he gave to his son Yosef. Again, the DNA helix, the dream of Yaakov, how the DNA goes from generation to generation. And Yosef had that strength because of the battle that Yaakov fought against the Malach of Esav, against the Satan, against the Yetzer Hara. And Yosef was able to overcome that. So, because he was strong enough to fight his Yetzer Hara, he was rewarded with prison. Right? He gets sent to prison for years. And then we know the story of the dreams. Next week in Miketz, we'll talk a little bit more about the dreams, but because he saved the wine steward and the baker, he winds up in front of Paro, and we'll learn the rest of it next week. But we see, you would think Yosef, after this, he overcomes his Yetzer Hara. He could have sinned with the wife of Potiphar, and all these things, and he winds up in prison. He's probably like, God, what are you doing? But God, we all know God has a plan. Ufanai lo yera'u, v'ra'ita ta'chorai, ufanai lo yeru. You don't see it at the time, but I'm sure when he was sitting on the throne and he was in charge of all of Egypt, then he went back and he goes, I see what you did there. So that's how we have to go through life, realizing that we think, Magia li X, Y, and Z, I deserve this, I'm a good guy, I'm a good girl, why are bad things happening? What we think are bad things. There are no bad things, right? I mean, Kol man davar rachmana latava of it. Everything God does is for the best. What seems at the time such a bad thing, we realize we could wind up in the snap of a finger, in the blink of an eye, on the throne of the most powerful nation in the world. Look at how it happened for Yosef. But that's the lesson of Yosef and Potiphar's wife. even though you do the right thing, sometimes you're not rewarded immediately. But eventually, even if it's not in this world, if it's in the next, everything, there is a judge and there is justice. Let's talk a little bit about Chanukah, since it is the first night of Chanukah. And I want to hearken back to something I learned from my Rebbe, Rav Meir Kahana, Zecher Tzadik, Kodesh L'Bracha, Zchus Yagein Aleinu, Hashem Yinkom Damav. Who are the Maccabim fighting? What's the story of Chanukah, first of all? Well, we know the story about the lights. Okay. But let's talk about the actual story. What happened? So around 167 BCE, Judea, by the way, which is where this occurred, Modi'in, the West Bank, Yehuda and Shomron. Antiochus was the Greek king, Antiochus IV, who was the son of Antiochus III. That happened a lot. And he made a decree. He was trying to Hellenize the Jews. That's what he was trying to do. He was trying to make them more Greek, right? More like the nations around. And there was a movement, a very strong movement within the Jewish people that they wanted to be more Greek. So they set up an idol to Zeus, and along came some Reform Jew. I'm going to use the term. I said it because it was a type of reform, and decided to to worship the idol, bring a sacrifice. I don't know what they did, right? Comes Matis Yahu Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and he says, "What's this BS?" Took his sword and ran the guy right through. And that began a civil war. A civil war between the traditional Orthodox Jews and the Hellenist Jews, the ones that wanted to be more Greek. Fill in the blank. And this was a pretty bad civil war. Antiochus sided, of course, with the Hellenists, right? Because that's what that's where he saw his best interests. And then he comes up with a decree: no Brit Milah, no Shabbat, no Limud Torah. No learning Torah, no keeping of the Sabbath, and no circumcision. And that, of course, caused a blank storm amongst the Maccabim, the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, the Orthodox Jews at the time. And then it became a war not only against the Mityavnim, the Hellenist Jews, but against the Syrian Greeks, who were at that time in possession of Judea. So, what's Hanukkah really about? If you grow up in America, you're taught, certainly in non-Orthodox circles, but they paint Hanukkah as this religious, this whole idea of individual freedom. Whether it's religious or any type of freedom. But Hanukkah is probably the least Hellenized of all the holidays, yet in Chutz La'aretz, in the rest of the world, it's probably the most Hellenized, because it tends to coincide with Christmas. Interesting that Hanukkah is the 25th day of the month of Kislev. Christmas is the 25th day of December. I'm not so sure that that's a coincidence on the 25th of December part. But it became, in Chutz La'aretz, the Jewish Christmas. And Hanukkah is the one holiday of all the Jewish holidays that should not be made into the Jewish anything. It is teaching us how our forefathers, in this case the Maccabees, how they fought against Hellenization, how they fought against assimilation. It wasn't a holiday celebrating freedom from religion, but it was the freedom to worship the way we are taught to worship, the way we are supposed to worship Hashem, and to keep His mitzvot. And you see that the Maccabim, the Hashmonayim, felt that it was worth going to war to keep the Torah. Think about that for a second. Hanukkah has been turned into anything but in Chutz La'aretz. Baruch Hashem, here in Israel, I think it's a lot more traditional. It's not a lot more traditional, it's completely traditional. And a lot of kids here really know Hanukkah, and you'd have to explain to them what Christmas is. You ask any American Jewish kid, they'll know Christmas. They'll know that they'll call Hanukkah the Jewish Christmas. I'm not talking about kids that went to yeshiva, right? They're not even going to know the story. But that's the story. The story is, and the story was, and the story always will be, how the Maccabim, how the Hashmonayim, the Kohanim, a ragtag bunch, beat the most powerful army of the day in order to be able to keep the Torah and the mitzvahs. And that, when we light the Hanukkah lights, and really, the story with the menorah, just to jump in, they tell us, the Gemara tells us that they found one jar of oil. It was enough for one day. It miraculously burnt for 8. And that was the days that they were rededicating the Beit HaMikdash after it was defiled by the Hellenists and the Greeks. That's the story of the menorah. But remember, Rav Kahana wrote this in his one of his magnum opus articles that appeared in the Jewish press back in, I believe it was 1972. It was called Down with Hanukkah. Right, showing how no liberal American Jew should be keeping Hanukkah if they're trying to assimilate, because that goes against their very nature, goes against what they're trying to accomplish. So when we hear stories in New York and other places about people not being allowed to worship freely, think about what the Maccabim would have done. Shabbos Makar Bracha. This is a big Shabbos. It's Shabbos Hanukkah. We have Hallel. We have extra light. We have the Hanukkah lights, and we have the light of the menorah. The menorah is the Ora Shel Torah, the light of Torah, which is what the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash in the temple symbolized. That was the light of Torah. That's why the Kohen lit the menorah every day. So think about that this week when we're sitting around the Shabbos table making Kiddush, having challah, latkes this time. My Ruchi asked me, what type of kugel should I make this week? I'm like, potato! A fried one. Make a big latke, like my bubby used to make. We used to call it a fried heart attack because it was, full of oil and crunchy and delicious. So enjoy the latkes. Take it easy if you have high cholesterol or high blood pressure. Don't overdo it. But enjoy Hanukkah, the lights, the Torah, the singing, the Zmiris, the Divrei Torah. And remember, Ein Yisrael Nigalin Ela B'schus HaShabbos. Shabbos is the most important, in my opinion, of all the mitzvot that we do physically. Shabbos is probably the most important. Thank you for joining us. Join us back here. Hopefully we'll be able to get in Miketz this week because there's a lot to talk about. Have a wonderful Shabbos and a happy and joyous Hanukkah. Shabbat Shalom and Hanukkah Sameach.